First things first, today we're going to be talking about parts of speech. This table is just one way that we're going to be thinking about the relationship between grammar and sentences, which are the basic unit of how we communicate. We can think of any sentence as having two parts, a subject and a predicate. Now, the subject can be broken down into what's called a noun phrase. A noun phrase might have just one word, in which case it would be a one-word noun phrase, which is also the subject. Sometimes, however, a couple of words can be part of the noun phrase, in which case the main word would be called the head word. Everything else would be called a modifier. On the predicate side, we have the verb. Every sentence must have a noun and a verb, which also may have the object, phrases, and modifiers. We'll get to the object and the phrases and modifiers later, but for now, know that a sentence has two parts, subject, predicate, which can be broken down into the noun phrase, and the predicate, which must include a verb. To give you an example of this, we might take the sentence, "You are reading the sentence." Here we can see that if we break it down, we have you, which is the subject, the noun phrase, or head word, and then the predicate, are reading this sentence. We can break these down into are reading, the verb phrase, and the object, sentence. In this case, this is a modifier that tells us which sentence. To talk about the parts that make up the sentence, we could think about them in terms of classes. And there are two classes, form class and structure class. As we can see, form class includes nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, while structure class includes prepositions, conjunctions, expletives, determiners, auxiliaries, and qualifiers. I know what you're thinking. Why the hell would we do this? Well, the thing is, while we will talk about things like noun, verb, adjectives, and so on, thinking about them in first as form class or structure class helps us think not only what they are, but what they do. The grammatical definition of a form class word would be words that have inflectional endings and forms that distinguish them from other parts of speech and grammatical relations. Now that's a lot of technical mumbo jumbo, so let's think about it instead in terms of a real life example. We would often define a noun as a person, place, or thing, but that's pretty broad. We might instead define it in terms of form class as noun. It can be made plural, it can take a possessive, etc., etc. Form class can be called an open class, which means it does accept new members, and it's huge. For example, we didn't have the word bling bling in the 1700s. That was added later. By contrast, the structure class is a very small group. Words in the structure class indicate grammatical relationships between other words. This would be something like a preposition, a conjunction. It's a very close class, which means that it's not accepting new applicants. Let's talk about nouns for a second. I've separated them into two columns that roughly correspond to some of the features that define what that type of noun does. On the left-hand side, we have countable, concrete, and common nouns. A countable concrete noun is the one that we usually think of. It'd be something like apple or bottle, something that becomes plural when we add an S to it, something that takes an article like the or a. Common nouns would be things like firefighter, things that don't need an uppercase in the beginning of the sentence. On the right-hand side, we have abstract uncountable nouns, proper nouns, and verbal nouns. An abstract or uncountable noun would be something like justice or kindness, right? We don't say the justice or the kindness. This also relates to something called a proper noun. Proper nouns are ones that do not take the or a. People's first names would be considered a proper noun. The last, the verbal noun, is actually a form of a verb. Haha, imagine that. Usually this is the ing form. So for example, running is my favorite sport. In this case, running, which is usually considered a verb, is acting as the subject of the sentence. Another type of noun is the pronoun. When we know what we're talking about, we use pronouns in order to reduce wordiness, repetition, etc., etc. There are a couple different kinds of pronouns, and these are just a few. The one you're most familiar with would be obviously the subject pronoun, at least the phrase subject pronoun. I, you, she, he, it, we, you, they. In the middle section, we have the object pronouns. Me, you, her, him, its, us, you, them. In this case, we would say something like, you hit me, not you hit I. You would be in the subject, and me would be the object pronoun. The final column would be the possessives, so that's my, your, her, our, your, their. The weird thing about possessives is there's two forms. The first form is when we don't actually know what we're talking about yet, so my hat. Once we know what the subject or object is, then we can say mine, yours, hers, ours, so on and so forth. The S indicates that we have already been introduced to whatever the noun is. There are additional ones such as all, many, so on and so forth. These are called collective pronouns. We'll talk about those later. The next form class words we'll be talking about are adverbs and adjectives, describers. An adverb modifies verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. If we break down the word adverbs, we actually can remember that. So adjectives are adverbs, verbs, verbs. These are what they modify. Don't get them confused with adjectives. Usually they end with ly, like quickly, but not always. So, for example, well would be an adverb that doesn't end with ly. Adjectives, on the other hand, modify nouns and pronouns. Some subclasses of adjectives are part of the structure class as opposed to the form class. The last topic we need to talk about before we move on to verbs are prepositions. Prepositions usually answer questions related to location or time, and often they're put together with other words to create something called prepositional phrases. Examples of simple prepositions would be in, on, over, by, from, to, so on and so forth. Prepositional phrases can modify nouns and verbs. Thus, we can refer to them as being either adverbial, acting like an adverb, or adjectival, acting like an adjective. Finally, verbs. Verbs are wonderful and frustrating. We can split verbs into 5 types: modals, intransitive verbs, linking verbs, transitive verbs, and auxiliary verbs. Today, we are only going to talk about linking and intransitive verbs. We'll get to transitive, auxiliary, and modals later on. It's important to know that one verb can belong to many different categories, so understanding how it's functioning in the sentence will change how we understand what category the verb falls under. Let's talk about the first sentence pattern. To be is a very, very special verb. It gets its own sentence pattern. That's pretty effing cool. To be has several different forms, often we don't realize. Is, are, were, was, will be, being are all forms of our verb to be. And with an adverbial preposition that tells location or something of that sort, we get our very first pattern. For the example, Alex is at home, we can break this down into the subject, Alex, and the predicate, is at home. This is a one-word noun phrase where the head word is Alex. In this case, we have subject plus some form of the verb to be plus an adverbial prepositional phrase. The phrase at home is modifying the verb is. It's telling us where Alex is. To be can also act as what's called a linking or copular verb. Copular in the sense that it couples things. A linking or copular verb renames something as something else. While to be is the most common, other words that relate to the senses can also act as linking verbs, such as smell, feel, looks, seems. Let's look at the example. Robert Downey Jr. smells gorgeous. If we were to break this down into the subject and predicate, the subject would be Robert Downey Jr., and the predicate would be is or smells gorgeous. Notice, Robert Downey Jr. is 3 words. This is the noun phrase. And it would also be the head word because it's a proper noun. In pattern 2, we see subject plus a linking verb plus the subject complement. A subject complement is the thing that renames or is equated to the subject. It can be a noun or an adjective. But don't be fooled. Just because it sounds like it should be a compliment, a subject complement need not be positive. We could say Robert Downey Jr. is ugly, and ugly would still be considered the subject complement. The last sentence pattern that we'll be looking at today is with the intransitive verb. An intransitive verb is one that does not require a direct object in order to make sense. For example, she sleeps. If I just said she sleeps, you would totally understand what I'm thinking about. While on the couch gives us more information, it's not necessary to the actual meaning of the sentence. This is why for pattern 3, we have subject plus intransitive verb within parentheses plus an adverbial prepositional phrase, something that modifies the intransitive verb. On the couch tells us where she's sleeping. While on the couch might seem like it's receiving the action of sleeping, don't let it confuse you. It is not a direct object. We'll talk about that more later. God, I really wish there was a way to write this. Oh wait, there is! Oh yeah!
Y'all ready for this?
Well, that was fun. Was that fun for you? Okay, so we need to talk about these things called sentence diagrams. So you need a paper, you need your pen or your marker or whatever, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to make a cross. And this is going to separate what we've been talking about all along, which is our subject and our predicate. That's right, kids, your subject and your predicate. Okay, so let's say that our sentence is Sally eats. So that would be an intransitive verb. Our subject is Sally and our verb is eats. It would look something like this. See? Isn't that easy? Sally eating. Go, Sally. We're proud of you, Sally. For the top diagram, for a linking verb, we can see that we have our cross with the subject separated from the verb. On the right-hand side, we have a line that's slanted that's pointing back to the subject that separates the subject complement from the rest of the sentence. In the bottom, for intransitive or be verbs, we have the subject again separated from the verb, and what's modifying the verb, that prepositional phrase, with the object of the preposition below it. So I lied a little bit. Yeah. So objects, right? So a preposition is going to be one of those small words, right? On, by, whatever. And then let's look at the phrase on the couch, okay? So we have on, right? On would be our small preposition. The other part of it, the noun part, is going to be the object of that preposition. It's going to be the object that the preposition owns. See? Not really so hard, I promise. I certainly don't expect you to understand exactly how diagrams work right now. But things to notice are that descriptions, like adverbs and adjectives, go on slanted lines or next to slanted lines, like the object complement. Nouns and verbs usually go on horizontal lines. Exceptions to these rules do exist, and we'll continue to discuss them throughout the semester. If you'd like to review, make sure to check out your style manual. I've cued you in to the pages and subjects that we have covered in this particular film. Additionally, you can go on CourseHub and find information about diagramming sentences as well as the sentence patterns. That